Welcome back. We start from India, where fresh protests against a controversial new citizenship law have begun in several cities, including the capital, New Delhi. Earlier, the government shut down internet services in a number of cities a day after mass protests against the law. Mobile phone services have also been cut off in Lucknow and Mangalore and some parts of West Bengal. Several areas in Uttar Pradesh state are also affected. Meanwhile, following a High Court order, data services in the state of Assam have been restored. Moving on to the US, which has announced more sanctions on Iran over its handling of human rights issues. Speaking in Washington, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the US government will freeze the assets of 2 Iranian judges for giving harsh sentences to human rights activists and others. He said Iranian authorities may have killed more than 1,000 anti-government protesters since mid-November. Pompeo said Tehran's human rights violations are unacceptable. He announced Washington will restrict visas for Iranian officials responsible for a crackdown on demonstrators. The US has imposed a series of sanctions on Iranian firms and officials while seeking dialogue with Tehran. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has arrived in Japan at the invitation of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Rouhani is making the first visit to Japan by an Iranian leader in nearly 2 decades. Japan's foreign ministry says PM Abe will host a summit with President Rouhani. It said the two sides will discuss bilateral ties, regional and international issues. Rouhani's 2-day visit is a part of Tehran's efforts to maintain friendly ties with Tokyo. In Libya, the Haftar's eastern forces claim that have launched more than 10 airstrikes against UN-backed government forces in Misrata. In a statement, it said a military camp was also hit. Earlier, Khalifa Haftar's eastern forces warned they will target any Turkish forces entering Libya. The threat came after the government of National Accord approved the implementation of a military deal with Turkey. Previously, Haftar ordered the start of the final stage of a military campaign to take over Tripoli. In Algeria, Abdelmajid Tebboune has been sworn in as the 8th president of the North African country. After the inauguration, Tebboune accepted the resignation of Prime Minister Nourindine Bedeau. He appointed Sabri Boukhadom as interim Prime Minister. Tebboune instructed the rest of the cabinet to stay in office as part of a caretaker government pending the formation of a new team. Tebboune said discussions on writing a new constitution will begin in a few weeks. He also promised to meet demands for radical change and the rule of law, loudly voiced in 10 months of protests. Algeria has been plagued by wide-scale public demonstrations since February 22nd. In Yemen, warring parties in the Taiz governorate have exchanged dozens of prisoners in a locally mediated swap. The deal coincided with renewed diplomatic efforts by the UN this week. The government says its 75 detainees were released, while the Houthis confirmed 60 of their people were set free. Yesterday, the warring parties also agreed to create humanitarian corridors in the key port city of Hodeidah. The two sides signed a UN-brokered agreement last year that included a ceasefire for Hodeidah and an exchange of over 15,000 prisoners. Moving on to Lebanon, where newly named Prime Minister says he will quickly form a government to pull the country out of its economic crisis. He said political and security stability is a cornerstone for the protection of the country. Prime Minister said he will address protesters' grievances by making reforms.
I will work hard to form a government as soon as possible through consultation with previous prime ministers, whose opinions and advice I will benefit from, and with parliamentary blocs and lawmakers.
Yesterday, Diab was named premier with backing from the Iran-backed Hezbollah and its allies. Now from Japan, which has urged Russia to free the crew members of Japanese fishing boats it has detained. Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi met his Moscow with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. In a joint press conference, Lavrov said he asked Tokyo to instruct fishing crew members not to break existing laws. The two agreed to hold a working group meeting in January 2020 on joint economic activities on a chain of disputed islands. Lavrov said Russia is ready to engage in long-term efforts, even though the work ahead will not be easy. He later called the talks constructive and substantial. Moscow controls 4 islands, which Tokyo maintains are an inherent part of Japanese territory. The territorial dispute has prevented them signing a formal end to World War II. Russia and Ukraine have reached agreement in principle on a new gas transit contract. The settlement was mediated by the European Union and Germany. The current 10-year contract between the two countries for piping Russian gas through Ukraine runs out at the end of this year. European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic made the announcement after lengthy talks between the two countries.
After this very intensive talk, I'm very glad to say that we reached agreement in principle on all key elements, which I believe is very good and very positive news for Europe, for Russia, for Ukraine, for gas markets, and for citizens in all countries.
As the most important transit route for Russian gas, Ukraine earns billions of US dollars in fees every year. Last month, Sweden's appellate court upheld an order for Kremlin to pay over $2.5 billion to Kiev in a contract dispute. Furthermore, the French military has deployed armed drones in Africa's Sahel region as part of its 7-year fight against extremist groups. Defense Minister Florence Parly said the drones were used to provide surveillance support but will now strike targets. She said this is new capacity, not a change in doctrine. Parly said American-built Reaper UAVs fitted with laser-guided missiles are part of the Bulletin mission. Earlier this month, militants attacked a military camp in western Niger, which left 71 personnel dead. French soldiers from the Bulletin mission have set up a temporary operating base in the middle of enemy territory. In difficult conditions and with the permanent risk of attack, the troops live their daily lives. More about life in these camps in this report.
Soldiers from France's 4,500-strong Bulletin mission in the Sahel perform the same ritual every night in the field. They set up what they call a BOAT, using the French acronym for Temporary Advance Forward Base. This is their camp for the night, in the heart of enemy territory.
The idea is to form a square, a bit like you see in the westerns, and we sleep inside, with people keeping watch, so that we can be protected by the vehicles.
Arranging the vehicles in formation is a precise operation. Armoured vehicles form a protective perimeter to shield from attack, and a command centre lies in the middle. Inside this setup, soldiers can remove their bulletproof vests. All that remains to be done is to unload the trucks, set up the bunks, and polish the weapons after a day in the savannah.
I think the sand is one of the worst things here. You sort of get used to it though. It gets everywhere, but we clear up. It gets in our mouths too, but you get used to it.
Field missions generally last 2 to 3 weeks. Comfort is minimal, but the soldiers have been trained for these conditions, and few complain.
We adapt very easily, and then in the evening when we're more relaxed, we can get out the deck of cards, we can talk, laugh, all while remaining operational on the mission.
The soldiers pack up the camp before dawn. After just a few hours sleep, anything not taken away is burned on site. They then set off again, driving into the evening, when they will set up their next temporary home.
In the UK, the Brexit negotiations have continually stalled on the question of the Irish border. Since the end of Northern Ireland conflict in the 1990s, both sides of the divided village reintegrated. Now, Petago, a village straddling both sides of the border, is worried by the new challenges Brexit may bring. This report has the details.
Petago still has its old customs post, but it's been decades since it was used. The village is divided by the border which runs along the river, with Northern Ireland on the right and the Irish Republic on the left. Since peace talks in the 1990s, crossing has been seamless, with the line in the tarmac the only noticeable change. But things weren't always this way. Mechanic Mervyn Johnston remembers the troubles vividly. His garage is right on the border, and as a former member of the British Army, he was a target for Southern Republicans.
Now, this wasn't the original garage. The original garage is on the other side of the road, and that has been blown up completely twice. And where you're sitting now, this was the post office, and there was a bomb disposal chap killed here defusing a bomb.
Elsewhere in the village, the prospect of Brexit is having some effect. At the post office on the southern side, Northerners have been taking full advantage of their right to apply for Irish EU passports.
Well, after the vote came in, I think it was 2016, very shortly, it doubled fairly quick after that. And it's doubled every year since, and huge interest now since the beginning of this year again.
A few miles away, there's another remnant of the old hard border. The villages of Belcoo and Blacklion used to share a railway station, but the bridge connecting them was blown up in the 1970s by British Army engineers to stop it being used by smugglers. Few here expect Brexit to bring such stark division back, and the hope is that it won't reverse years of deepening integration since the Good Friday Peace Agreement.
We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called on the US not to sign a trade deal with China unless Beijing agrees to release 2 detained Canadians. Trudeau said his administration has worked effortlessly in order to secure the Canadians' release. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Saparo have been accused of espionage and held in China since 2018. The 2 men were picked up shortly after police in Vancouver held Huawei's chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou on a US arrest warrant. President Xi Jinping says China will not allow foreign forces to interfere with its special regions at Hong Kong and Macau. Xi made the remarks while addressing a ceremony marking the 20th anniversary of Macau's handover to Chinese rule. The president officiated the oath ceremony of Macau's chief executive Ho Lat Seng. She said Macau's patriotism is the important reason for the success of its one country, 2 systems formula of governance.
This success in Macau shows that by ensuring the implementation of one country, 2 systems formula stay constant, the foundation of one country, 2 systems can be sustained in the long run.
With 51 states, including the United States, still refusing to pay the bulk of their dues to the UN, the world body continues to grapple with its biggest budget deficit in a decade. This could be seen at the recent disarmament talks in Geneva, where new cost-cutting measures forced ambassadors to shout out their speeches without microphones. Details in this report.
The UN is currently struggling with a $768 million deficit in its $2.85 billion budget for 2019. So far this year, 51 states are not up to date on their payments, including 2 of the UN's biggest funders, the United States and Brazil. The organisation is now in the 3rd month of tough budget cuts, which could be seen at last month's disarmament talks in Geneva.
At 6:10, the interpreters left us. And I think the sound engineer also left at 6:25 or 6:30. I think my first experience in my diplomatic career was when I saw the alarms going off at around 6:30.
Ambassadors were reduced to making their speeches under dimmed lights and without microphones. Even the lifts at the UN headquarters building weren't working. The UN Secretary-General warned of this crisis back in October.
These months we will reach the deepest deficit of the decade. We risk exhausting the closed peacekeeping cash reserves and entering November without enough cash to cover payrolls.
Diplomats and analysts say the crisis underlines the weakening international commitment to multilateralism. They point to last week's UN climate talks in Madrid, reaching only a limited deal as further evidence. This could become a serious problem in the future, as the accelerating global climate and refugee crises leave millions vulnerable.
In the U.S., the House of Representatives has approved a new North American trade deal. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was passed by 385 votes to 41, replacing the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement. The USMCA includes tougher labor and automotive content rules, but leaves over $1 trillion in annual trade flows mostly unchanged. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi gave the USMCA a green light last week after striking a deal with the Trump administration. Labor disputes in the new trade deal were one of the sticking points in negotiations.
Virtually almost every union is supporting the agreement, and there's a reason for that. This is a significant improvement over the original NAFTA. It is a significant improvement over the NAFTA that Donald Trump brought back to us. The agreement he brought back to us was totally unenforceable. It would have been a little tweaking of the old NAFTA.
The trade deal was first agreed in September 2018, but the U.S. Congress insisted on major changes to labor and environmental provisions. The pact, which must be ratified by lawmakers in all three countries, still faces a vote in the Republican majority U.S. Senate. Moving on. Its benchmark lending rate steady for December as predicted by economists. The People's Bank of China kept the one-year loan prime rate, the LPR, unchanged at 4.15% from the previous month. The bank also kept the five-year LPR the same at 4.8%. Twice this month, the central bank pumped up a total of over $85.5 billion into the banking system. Earlier this week, China's PM Li Qiang said the economy could face downward pressure next year, confronted by slowing demand and U.S. trade tariffs. China's economic growth has slowed to nearly 30-year lows in the third quarter. European stock markets are trading higher on the back of trade deal progress between the U.S. and China. Investors are upbeat about the recent market rallies, making substantial gains. Frankfurt's DAX is trading nearly 0.5% higher. The CAC 40 in Paris has gained a fraction. London's FTSE 100 is trading fractionally higher ahead of the UK's third quarter GDP data due to be released later in the day. In Asia, the Shanghai Composite closed nearly 0.5% lower in a slowing economy hit by US trade tariffs and shrinking demand. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 lost a fraction as Japan's auto sector stocks plunged. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.